The Unseen. Chapter 1. The Stranger in Town. It started as any other fall afternoon in the small town of Harrington. The trees that lined Main Street were ablaze in fiery oranges and reds, their leaves swirling to the ground like forgotten memories. The air carried a slight chill, the promise of winter creeping ever closer. The town itself was quiet, sleepy even, as if nothing ever truly happened there. But then he arrived. The stranger came on foot, emerging from the forest at the edge of town. He was tall, with a face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were plain, almost too ordinary, like he was trying not to be noticed. Yet there was something about him, a feeling that caused people to avert their eyes, to not look too closely. It was as if their minds refused to acknowledge him fully. Mrs. Gilbert, the owner of the only diner in Harrington, was the first to encounter him. She had been wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled softly. She glanced up, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the room. "Afternoon," she said, trying to sound friendly, though her voice carried a nervous edge she couldn't explain. The man nodded but said nothing as he walked slowly to the counter and sat down. He removed his hat and placed it beside him with deliberate care. His hair was dark and slicked back, and his skin had an odd, pallid quality, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. "Coffee?" Mrs. Gilbert offered. The man nodded again, and she quickly poured a steaming cup, setting it in front of him. For a moment, he simply stared at the liquid, as if contemplating something deeper, something that made her feel uncomfortable. When he finally took a sip, he looked up at her with a gaze that sent a chill down her spine. "You're new in town," she ventured, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "I won't be here long," he replied in a voice so quiet, she almost didn't hear it. Mrs. Gilbert nodded awkwardly, not sure how to continue the conversation. There was something unsettling about him, something she couldn't put her finger on. She had lived in Harrington her whole life, and this man, this stranger, felt like he didn't belong. The bell jingled again as Sheriff Paul Hendricks entered the diner, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor. He tipped his hat to Mrs. Gilbert and then glanced over at the stranger. "Afternoon," the sheriff said, his tone friendly but guarded. The stranger merely nodded in response, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. The tension in the room thickened, though nothing had been said. Sheriff Hendricks took a seat at the far end of the counter and ordered his usual, black coffee and a slice of pie. As the sheriff settled in, Mrs. Gilbert noticed something strange. The reflection of the stranger in the diner's large window. It was there, but it wasn't quite right. It was distorted, like a smudge on the glass. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and when she looked again, it was normal. Shaking off the unease, she hurried into the kitchen, leaving the two men alone. Sheriff Hendricks glanced back at the stranger, who sat unnervingly still. "You passing through?" the sheriff asked. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He took another sip of coffee before setting the cup down gently. "Just passing," he finally said, his voice as low and cold as before. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But some things, Sheriff, they stay with you." The sheriff frowned, but before he could respond, the stranger stood up, placed a few crumpled bills on the counter, and walked out of the diner without another word. The door swung shut behind him, leaving the sheriff and Mrs. Gilbert to exchange uneasy glances. Outside, the shadows seemed to deepen, and a gust of wind blew down Main Street, scattering leaves in its wake. No one saw where the stranger went, but one thing was certain: the town of Harrington would never be the same. Are you enjoying the suspense? Share with your friends and subscribe to follow what happens next. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. That night, the wind howled like a living thing, its icy fingers scraping against the windows of every house in Harrington. In the quiet of his own home, Sheriff Paul Hendricks sat at his kitchen table, staring at the uneaten plate of food in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to the stranger, to the cryptic words he had left behind. "But some things, Sheriff, they stay with you." What had he meant by that? It was a strange thing to say, but even stranger was the feeling it left behind. Hendricks had been sheriff in Harrington for over 15 years, and in that time he had learned to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right. As he sat there, his phone buzzed loudly against the table, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Hesitating for only a moment, he picked up the call. "Hello?" For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence on the other end, followed by a faint crackling noise, like a bad connection. He was about to hang up when he heard it, breathing. Slow, measured breaths, just loud enough for him to hear. A chill crept down his spine. "Who is this?" Hendricks demanded, his voice steady despite the discomfort settling in his gut. The breathing continued for another second or two, then stopped abruptly. In its place, a voice, so low and distorted it barely sounded human, whispered a single word. "Unseen." The line went dead. Sheriff Hendricks stood up from the table, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around the room, his eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but tonight felt different. It was as if the town itself had shifted, becoming something darker, something unfamiliar. He walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain to peer out into the darkness. The street was empty, the wind still whipping through the trees. Everything appeared normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting in the dark. Before he could dwell on it any longer, his radio crackled to life on the counter. "Sheriff? You there?" It was Deputy Riley, sounding unusually tense. Hendricks grabbed the radio, pressing the button to respond. "Go ahead, Riley. We got a situation," Riley said, his voice barely hiding the edge of fear. "You better get down to the old abandoned mill. Something's happened." Hendricks felt his pulse quicken. The old mill had been empty for years, a relic of the town's past. But something about this night made the call feel more ominous. "I'm on my way," he said, grabbing his keys from the counter. As he left the house, the cold wind hit him like a slap, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw something. A flicker of movement in the shadows just beyond the porch light's reach. He paused, staring into the darkness, but nothing moved. Shaking off the unease, he climbed into his truck and headed toward the mill, the feeling of being watched following him all the way. Want to know what happens at the mill? Don't forget to subscribe and share to unravel the mystery together. Chapter 3. The Old Mill. The old mill loomed like a skeletal giant against the night sky, its crumbling structure barely visible under the faint glow of the moon. Sheriff Hendricks parked his truck at the edge of the clearing, the beam of his headlights cutting through the darkness. The place had always felt eerie, abandoned for over a decade, its broken windows and sagging walls a reminder of better days. Deputy Riley stood at the entrance, his flashlight casting nervous arcs across the overgrown grass. Even from a distance, Hendricks could see the unease in his deputy's posture. As Hendricks approached, the younger man turned, his face pale under the harsh light of the beam. "What's going on, Riley?" Hendricks asked, keeping his voice steady. Riley swallowed hard before speaking. You need to see it for yourself, Sheriff. It's inside." Without another word, Riley turned and led the way into the mill, his footsteps hesitant. Hendricks followed, the familiar weight of his flashlight and sidearm providing little comfort in the creeping dark. The air inside the mill was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Their footsteps echoed through the empty space, a rhythmic sound that only heightened the tension. "What happened here?" Hendricks asked, his voice bouncing off the crumbling walls. "I got a call," Riley explained, keeping his flashlight trained on the ground ahead. "From one of the local kids. They were poking around here like they always do. But this time they found something." They reached the far end of the mill, where the floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet. Riley stopped in front of a large, rusted machine. once used to process grain, now nothing more than a relic. He shined his flashlight into the shadows beside it. Hendricks followed the beam of light, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, sprawled on the floor, was the body of a man. His clothes were torn, his face frozen in a mask of terror, eyes wide open as if he had seen something unspeakable in his final moments. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his fingers were twisted into unnatural angles, as if he had clawed at the floor in desperation. But it wasn't just the body that sent a shiver down Hendricks' spine. It was the fact that there were no visible wounds, no blood, nothing to explain how this man had died, or what had left him in such a state of terror. "Jesus," Hendricks muttered, kneeling beside the body. He reached out to check for a pulse, though he already knew the man was long gone. His skin was ice cold. "I don't understand, Sheriff," Riley said, his voice trembling. "There's no sign of what killed him. No weapon, no marks. It's like he was scared to death." Hendricks stood slowly, his mind racing. Something about this felt wrong, unnatural. He had seen bodies before, victims of accidents, murders, but this was different. The expression on the man's face was burned into his mind. A look of pure, unfiltered terror. "Did you recognize him?" Hendricks asked, his voice tight. Riley shook his head. "No, he's not from around here. I've never seen him before." Hendricks turned his gaze back to the body. There was something familiar about the man's clothes, the plain, almost too ordinary outfit. His mind raced back to the diner earlier that day, to the stranger who had spoken those cryptic words. Could it be him? Before Hendricks could dwell on the thought, his radio crackled to life. It was dispatch, but the signal was weak, filled with static. "Sheriff, need backup something." "Say again, dispatch?" Hendricks responded, pressing the button and holding the radio close to his ear. More static, followed by a faint voice that chilled him to the core. "Unseen." The word echoed through the radio, distorted and barely audible, but unmistakable. It was the same word from the phone call earlier that night, the same eerie whisper that had sent shivers down his spine. And now it had returned. Hendricks glanced at Riley, who had heard the transmission too. The deputy's face was pale, his hand trembling as he clutched his flashlight. "What the hell is going on, Sheriff?" Riley asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Hendricks replied, his mind racing. "But we need to figure it out fast." As they stepped outside the mill, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, growing longer, darker. Hendricks had the overwhelming sense that something was out there, watching them from the darkness. Something they couldn't see. Are you ready to discover the unseen terror? Subscribe now to stay on edge as the mystery deepens. Chapter 4. The Vanishing. By the time Sheriff Hendricks and Deputy Riley made it back to the patrol car, the feeling of being watched had only intensified. The shadows outside the mill seemed to pulse with a life of their own, twisting in unnatural ways. Riley, pale and shaken, kept looking over his shoulder as they climbed into the car. "Whatever's going on here, Sheriff, it's not right," Riley muttered as he fastened his seatbelt. "That voice on the radio, it sounded like the call I got earlier," Hendricks finished for him, his mind still spinning. He was trying to piece together what little they knew, but nothing made sense. The stranger, the body in the mill, the word unseen. It all felt like fragments of a puzzle, but none of them fit together. They drove in silence, the road ahead illuminated only by the narrow beams of the headlights. The wind had picked up, throwing leaves and debris across the road as the night deepened. It was well past midnight now, the town of Harrington wrapped in a blanket of darkness. The streetlights flickered as they passed, as though even they were afraid of what was lurking in the night. As they turned down Main Street, Hendricks noticed something strange. There were no lights on in the houses, not a single one. Harrington was a quiet town, sure, but this felt wrong. It was as if the whole place had gone dark. "Riley, did the power go out?" Hendricks asked, glancing at his deputy. "I don't think so," Riley replied, leaning forward to peer out the windshield. "But it sure feels like something's wrong." Just then, a figure appeared in the road, standing motionless in the beam of the headlights. Hendricks hit the brakes hard, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just feet away from the person. It was a woman, her clothes disheveled, her hair wild and matted. She stood in the middle of the road, staring at them with wide, glassy eyes. Hendricks and Riley exchanged a glance before Hendricks cautiously stepped out of the car, his hand hovering over the holster at his hip. "Ma'am?" he called out, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving, her gaze locked on the sheriff with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her eyes were vacant, like she wasn't really seeing him at all. "Ma'am, you need to step off the road." Hendricks tried again, but the woman remained still as though frozen in place. Suddenly, she began to whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but Hendricks could just make out the words. "It's coming. It's here. The unseen. The unseen." The hair on the back of Hendricks' neck stood on end. He approached slowly, trying not to spook her, but before he could get close, she turned and sprinted into the darkness, disappearing into the woods without another sound. "What the hell was that about?" Riley asked, getting out of the car and shining his flashlight into the trees. But there was no sign of her, no movement, no sound. It was as if she had vanished. Hendricks stared after her, his mind racing. Her words echoed in his head. "It's here. The unseen. We need to find out who she is," Hendricks said, heading back to the car. "Something's going on in this town, Riley, and I have a feeling it's only going to get worse." They drove through the empty streets, their unease growing with each passing minute. Every now and then, Hendricks would glance at the radio, half expecting it to crackle with another cryptic message. But the silence was even more unsettling. When they finally reached the station, the building was just as dark and lifeless as the rest of the town. The power was still on, but the lights inside flickered ominously. As they stepped inside, Hendricks' phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the unknown number on the screen. "Not again," he muttered before answering. The voice on the other end was the same, low, distorted, barely human. "It's coming, Sheriff," the voice whispered. "You can't stop it. It's unseen." The line went dead. Hendricks stood there, staring at the phone in his hand. His heart pounded in his chest as a sickening realization washed over him. Whatever this was, whatever the unseen was, it was already here, and it was only a matter of time before it showed itself. Want to discover the truth behind the unseen terror? Subscribe and share the suspense to unravel the mystery. Chapter 5. The Unseen Revealed. Hendricks stood in the dimly lit station, the air heavy with tension. The phone call played over and over in his mind, the word unseen echoing in the empty halls. Riley sat at his desk, nervously tapping a pencil against the edge of the table, the only sound breaking the eerie silence. "We need answers, Sheriff," Riley said, his voice shaking. "What are we dealing with? Some kind of lunatic? A prank?" Hendricks didn't respond immediately. His gut told him this was no prank, no hoax. Whatever was happening, it was real, and far more dangerous than either of them could comprehend. But where could they even begin to look for answers? "The mill," Hendricks said suddenly, his voice firm. "We need to go back to the mill. There's something we missed." Riley looked at him like he was crazy. "Sheriff, we already searched that place. All we found was a dead body and no explanation." "Exactly," Hendricks replied, grabbing his coat. "We don't have an explanation yet. Something about that place, about what happened there, is connected to this. And I'm not leaving any stone unturned." Riley hesitated but eventually grabbed his coat as well. They left the station and drove back through the darkened streets, the town seeming even more lifeless than before. The wind had died down, and an unnatural stillness hung in the air, as if the entire world were holding its breath. As they pulled up to the mill, the building loomed larger than before, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The broken windows seemed to stare down at them like empty eyes, and the shadows cast by the old machinery inside twisted unnaturally in the beams of their flashlights. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing once again through the abandoned space. Everything was as they had left it. The rusted machines, the cold, lifeless body still lying in the corner. But something felt different this time. The air was heavier, more oppressive, as if the very walls were watching them. Hendricks moved closer to the body, his flashlight illuminating the man's contorted face. He knelt beside him, searching for any clue, any detail he might have missed before. Then something caught his eye, a faint mark on the man's wrist. It was barely visible, like a bruise, but its shape was odd, almost like a handprint, but not a human one. "What the hell is that?" Riley asked, noticing the mark as well. Hendricks didn't answer. He ran his fingers over the bruise, feeling a cold shiver run down his spine. The print was too large, too distorted to be human. It was as if something unnatural had grabbed the man, something not bound by the physical laws of this world. "Do you feel that?" Riley whispered, his voice barely audible. Hendricks looked up. The room had grown colder, the temperature plummeting in a matter of seconds. Their breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of Hendricks' neck stood on end. He stood up slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his gun, though he doubted it would be of any use. The shadows seemed to shift again, swirling around them like a living thing. The wind outside picked up, howling through the broken windows. And then, out of the darkness, they heard it. A faint whisper. It was barely a sound, more like a breath passing through the air, but unmistakable. Unseen, Riley took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "Sheriff, what the hell is that?" Hendricks didn't answer. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something, just at the edge of his vision. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing in the corner of the room. But when he turned, it was gone. "It's here," Hendricks whispered, more to himself than to Riley. "What's here?" Riley demanded, his voice rising in panic. "What the hell is going on?" Hendricks didn't have an answer. He could feel it, whatever it was, moving closer, pressing in on them, unseen but undeniably present. His heart raced, and his instincts screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen, trapped by an overwhelming sense of dread. And then the whispers grew louder. "It sees you. It sees everything." Hendricks' flashlight flickered again, and this time, when it stabilized, the shadowy figure stood in the middle of the room. Tall, impossibly tall, its form wavering as if it were made of smoke. Its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless, a blank void that seemed to absorb the light around it. Riley stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rusted machinery. "Sheriff, we need to get out of here." But Hendricks couldn't move. The figure, the unseen, stood there, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the room, leaving him gasping for breath. And then it spoke. "You can't run." The voice was not a whisper this time. It was clear, sharp, cutting through the darkness like a knife. Hendricks felt its weight in his chest, its words sinking into his bones. He knew in that moment that running was pointless. Whatever this thing was, wherever it had come from, it wasn't bound by the rules of their world, and it wasn't going to let them go. The unseen is finally here. Want to see how this ends? Don't forget to subscribe and share to experience the final twists together. Chapter 6. The Final Sight. The figure, the unseen, moved slowly, its form shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. Hendricks couldn't tear his eyes away. His heart pounded, every muscle in his body tensing as the room seemed to shrink around them. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and a deep, primal terror gripped him. He finally found his voice, though it came out as a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, its silence louder than any words. Riley, still trembling, backed up against the wall, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The deputy's wide eyes flicked between Hendricks and the shadow, as if searching for any sign of hope. But there was none. Hendricks felt the overwhelming weight of the creature's attention, like it was peeling back the layers of his mind, seeing everything, every fear, every secret, every failure. The whispers began again, swirling around him, incoherent but filled with malice. "You are seen," it hissed, the voice sliding through the air like a blade. "You cannot hide. You cannot escape." The words sent a chill down Hendricks' spine. His thoughts raced, desperate for an answer, for anything that could help them. But how do you fight something you can't see? Something that exists beyond the world of the living? Riley, panicking, reached for his gun, fumbling with the holster. "We have to shoot it, Sheriff. We have to try something." "Don't," Hendricks barked, his voice sharp with fear. But Riley had already drawn his weapon, his hands shaking as he aimed at the figure. The shot rang out, deafening in the silence of the mill. The bullet passed through the figure as if it were nothing more than a shadow, disappearing into the darkness. The creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it seemed to grow darker, its form shifting and expanding as though Riley's attack had only made it stronger. Riley stared, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. What the hell? The figure turned its attention to the deputy, and in that instant, the air around Riley seemed to collapse inward. He gasped, clutching at his throat as if something invisible was choking him. His eyes bulged, his face turning purple as he fought to breathe. Hendricks lunged forward, trying to help, but it was too late. With a sickening snap, Riley's body went limp and collapsed to the ground. Hendricks froze, his mind reeling. He stared at his deputy's lifeless form, the cold reality of what had just happened sinking in. Riley was dead, just like the man in the mill, his life taken without a visible mark. The figure turned back to Hendricks, its featureless face locking onto him. He could feel its eyes even though there were none, feel them boring into him, watching him. It stepped closer, its form shifting with every movement, as though it was barely tethered to this reality. "You cannot run." The words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. Hendricks staggered back, his thoughts unraveling as panic took hold. There was no escaping this thing. It wasn't human, it wasn't bound by the rules of the living. And worst of all, it knew him, saw him. But as the figure drew closer, something flickered at the edge of Hendricks' awareness. A memory, a fragment of something the stranger had said in the diner. "But some things, Sheriff, they stay with you." The stranger had known. Somehow, he had been connected to all of this. Hendricks didn't know how or why, but he had a feeling that the answer lay with the man, if he could find him. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Hendricks forced himself to move. He backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving the figure. It watched him, but it didn't follow, as if it knew there was nowhere to run. "You will see what cannot be unseen." Hendricks didn't wait to find out what that meant. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the floor as he sprinted out of the mill and into the night. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he didn't stop. He ran through the darkness, the shadows chasing him, his mind screaming at him to keep moving, to get as far away as possible. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to find the stranger, the man who had started all of this. He was the key. As Hendricks ran through the silent streets of Harrington, the town seemed even more alien than before. The houses were dark, the streets deserted, and the wind carried whispers that he could no longer ignore. It was everywhere now, the unseen, watching, waiting, and soon it would come for everyone. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.